Okay, so our next question is, do variants occur at all in nature? Or at least this is what Darwin had. And I mean, you can just look around this room and are there variants in this room right now? And the resounding answer is definitely yes. We have differences in heights, we have differences in skin tone. Some people in this room have curly hair, some of them have straight. So this is a picture of me and my husband, and this is him executing one of his most important duties, which is reaching stuff that's really high for me and hanging things up. And so my question for you is, between the two of us, who do you think is more likely to survive just in the wild? Like, who do you think would die first? So ponder that question and we'll come back. So um, Darwin took a 2-year long survey trip to just kind of around the world. But one of the places that he went to was the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador. This is Ecuador here. And so they're this tiny chain of islands. There's about 12 to 15 or so. So important things to note. These islands are far from the mainland and they are far apart from each other. So it is hard, but not impossible for animals to travel in between them. And the other super important detail here is that the islands have very different environments. So some of them are very mountainous, some of them have, a lot of forests, some of them have, primarily flowering trees, some of them have, food sources that only have hard seeds, and some of them are, very rocky where, animals have to really dig around for food. I'm just going to repeat that for emphasis. These islands are far apart and they have really different environments between them. Okay. So, Darwin, his job on this ship was basically to collect animals and record. So that's what he did. He collects all these different birds that he sees, these finches. And he doesn't really know what he has at the time. He takes really, he draws really good pictures and he does the collections. He takes really good notes. But he thinks they're all the same species. And it turns out that Darwin really doesn't know anything about birds because when he got back to England and gave those finches to his, his bird friend, they were like, hey, where'd you get these? You have 14 different species here. And that was pretty shocking to him because he thought, these are all the same bird, they all looked alike. They looked like this bird that I saw on the mainland. I thought they were all the same thing. But before we're too hard on Darwin, my question to you is, what kind of bird is this? You've probably seen it around in town. So if you thought sparrow, you're technically right, but these are actually 9 different species of sparrow. So birds can be pretty hard to tell apart, so don't be too hard on Darwin. But when he went back to his notes, what he figured out is that the bird beak specifically seemed to match the environment that he got it from. So for this bird here, its diet was small insects and spiders, and so it had a small bill size, and that's just, what was available in the subtropical forests that it, lived in the trees. So this was kind of its area here. And then when he goes to this wider area, he finds this other bird that is a large seed eater, and it lived, even when it was on the same island, it was in a different environment. So it was like in the lowland, it was on the ground. And because it's eating large seeds, it would need a large beak to actually break those seeds open. So he found that bird there. But then he finds this other sort of intermediate bird that's in all the different islands and all the different habitats, and it had sort of this in-between phenotype. And so what he theorized happened was that there was a bird on the mainland in Ecuador. It's kind of a normal looking bird, and that this bird migrates to the island, like one of them. And that over time, that bird spreads out to the different islands. But because they had different niches and different food sources, only those individuals who inherited the traits that were favorable to their specific environment actually survived. So for this island, there was probably a lot of like small insects available, so you need the teeny tiny tweezer beak to get at those. And then for this bird, what was left over for them were just the large seeds. So they had the birds that had the bigger beaks survived more, they had more babies, and so then this species evolved versus this one who kept more of an intermediate phenotype and sort of, played that game. So natural selection is basically that only individuals who inherit the traits favorable to the environment survive, and they pass on those heritable traits to their children, right? So in this way, the environment, quote unquote, naturally selects for those favorable heritable traits. So in the question between me and my husband, who is more likely to survive, the question is, survives what? Because it depends on the environment. And because we now have this genetic data available to us, I can tell you with confidence that our great ancestors came from very different regions. So half of my DNA comes from Native Americans in central Mexico, whereas most of his DNA comes from northern Europe. And you can probably guess that the environment in central Mexico is really different from that in Europe. Europe is cold. They don't have a lot of sunlight, and so that accounts for some of the differences that you at least see in skin tone. And as far as like height, people were able to spread out in the Americas more, and so maybe there wasn't as much fighting as there was in Europe. On top of which, there's not a lot of food in the desert in central Mexico, so being smaller is an advantage, and these characteristics were naturally selected for. Because again, we're the product of an unbroken chain of inheritance. So only those people who had those favorable traits that was specific for their environment were able to survive. So you end up with very different looking people at the end. So where does that trait variability ultimately come from? And we studied this in our last unit. And so that variability comes from your genes. Right, remember that mutation is a random change in the DNA of a gene, so it's making a random change to one of those bases, which is going to give you a new form of allele, which can then be passed on. We also get variation from recombination of alleles during meiosis. Remember there were two parts to that, prophase 1 crossing over, and then the random orientation of homologous chromosomes in metaphase. So I just want to keep going and give you more evidence for evolution in natural selection and introduce you to industrial melanism. So all melanism is an increase in dark color. So this happens in basically all species, whether you're human or you're a cat here. So it just means that you produce more melanin, and so you have a darker color, and sometimes this can help animals camouflage themselves. So, okay, quick question, how many moths did you just see? If you said 2, there were actually 3 of them in here, and the reason that you couldn't see this little guy here is because he has an extra melanin. So these are the peppered moths, and they're probably one of the biggest or most prominent examples of natural selection in modern times. So industrial melanism occurs in response to pollution levels. So these guys lived in London. And in London in the 1800s, they started pumping lots of pollution into the environment, and this put soot all over everything. So that made these white moths really easy to see, and these guys were able to camouflage. So who do you think is going to get eaten first here in this picture? So just like it was easier for you to see these guys, it's easier for predators to see these two. So sure enough, the melanistic allele, and by extension the melanistic moths, increased dramatically after the mid-1800s because they were being selected for. They now had this advantageous allele, and they were able to pass it on because they weren't getting eaten by the birds, and they were able to pass on those genes, so they were naturally selected. So another example of natural selection is antibiotic resistance, right? So bacteria have this protein, it doesn't really matter what it's called, but they need it to build their cell walls. And antibiotics like penicillin are going to bind to this protein, blocking that function. And basically what this makes this happen is that when the bacterial cells are dividing, they usually separate and have temporary holes in them, and then they fill in those holes with new cell membrane components. But without this protein, those holes stay, and then the cell basically dies. So because we don't use this protein to do cell division, we do it completely differently. These antibiotics don't affect us. That's why they're able to kill bacteria, and we're able to live. So like here, on the left, you see this bacteria being treated with penicillin. On the right, they're just being left alone. And you can see it's when they're trying to divide that they actually, die, because that's when the antibiotic is acting. So remember that mutations are always occurring randomly. So if I take a regular bacteria and I put it on a penicillin plate, they're going to die right away, at least until one of them just has a random mutation in that gene, and then they're going to be resistant all of a sudden. And then once they have that resistance, guess who's going to multiply and then be around? it's going to be only the one that had the antibiotic resistant gene, so it'll have been naturally selected. And this is kind of a problem because more and more of the bacteria are becoming resistant, and that's due to the overprescription of antibiotic drugs since the 1980s. It also became commonplace to have antibiotics in livestock. And so the bacterial environment changed, and now it's being heavily selected only for bacteria that can survive the antibiotics. And so that is why, that is occurring. So evidence for for evolution and natural selection. So first thing is that we know that genetic variation occurs through random mutations. That's always going to happen. But some of them are going to provide an advantage that improves survival. And if that parent survives, they're able to pass those alleles to children who also survive and then produce more offspring. And so this is how the environment, quote unquote, selects those advantageous mutations, because only those who have it survive. And that's true for humans in different environments. It's true for the finches in the different environments, or if you're a bacteria and your environment changes, it's true for all living things. So these examples of natural selection, so the human skin tone that evolved at different latitudes, the Galapagos finches, their beaks were matching their environment. They evolved to match the environment. We have antibiotic resistance in bacteria, and then there's also the industrial melanism in the peppered moth. Okay, so we're going to pause there.